the Government Agricultural Service and worked in the business for many, many years, who I've known vicariously for half my career, because I worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland, where she had many friends, but I only got to meet her properly about 2 years ago. And Vicky's very game at helping policy exchange with many of the things we like to put on. Is always a very stimulating colleague to have. And Tony Yates, who used to be a Bank of England official, who's now at Birmingham University and has given a lot of thought in all his blogs and to these things. So we're very pleased to have this panel, and I'm hoping that when the panel finish, Lord Skidelsky, who joined us and will be speaking later on, it's great to have Keynes's biographer here, because he can correct our homework as we go. And I thought that...
Not just your homework, your views.
No. So we have an appropriate test for all of us. But John, why don't you kick off? Because I know you've given some particular thought to some of Keynes's close colleagues.
Well, thank you very much. I start by saying I'm scared stiff with having Bob Skidelsky in the audience, because he's forgotten more about Keynes than I will ever know. And so I'm not going to go down that route of saying what Keynes really meant and so on. I don't think that's helpful from somebody of my tender age. But I did want to start by saying that I thought that that Paul, by going to the multiplier on the one hand and animal spirits on the other, was addressing not necessarily the heart, but one heart of Keynesianism. They've certainly been on my mind pretty much all my life. We're all products of where we've been and whom we've talked to, and I never met Keynes, just missed him as it were. But when I got to Cambridge, Nicky Caldor, Austin Robinson, Joan Robbins were in full cry, and you could feel Keynes's presence in the air. To some extent, I have to say, it was a little bit ludicrous, because everything, whatever the problem was, it got analysed in Keynesian aggregate demand terms. But that was probably inevitable. Chicago is no different in its way. When you go to Chicago, you can smell the grates in the air there. I just wanted to focus on something which Paul alluded to, and I think it's terribly important, although I don't know how you would operationalize it. And that is the dynamic implications of what Paul was saying. I was struck that by an article in 1964 by Robin Matthews called "Why Has Britain Had Full Employment Since the War?" Using
1968.
Sorry?
1968.
68.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's right, 2 years before I arrived. That's right. And he said, and I never really understood the article, and I thought about it on and off over the years, because what he said was, the obvious answer is effective aggregate demand management policy. But he said, if you look at the amount of stimulus which policies provided each year, it's very small. And that's when initially I parted company, because I thought, what's very small? But I came to realize he meant very small relative to, say, the stimulus you would have had to have provided to get you out of something like the Great Depression. So in other words, he came to the conclusion it wasn't the act of active fiscal policy that did it. And so he concluded, I think eminently reasonably, that it was the belief that the government had at its disposal the tools to keep the economy at full employment that led to the expectation on the part of businesses that output would be at or near full employment, which led to investment being at a level appropriate for that, which in turn brought it about. So after that, it was very easy to work, for example, with Nicky Caldor and to some extent with Joan and Austin, but it was really Nicky who wanted to operationalise that and emphasise something which I think is of crucial importance, which is that these animal spirits do, in a longer run sense, determine your growth rate and not just the deviation of your output from potential. And what I worry about in today's world is that probably for the first time in my life, animal spirits, not just in this small economy, but much more generally, may, with the possible exception of the US, have been ratcheted down to the point where firms, when they look ahead, don't see a particularly rapid rate of growth of output in prospect, and therefore have become extremely cautious about investing. Imagine being CEO and going and saying to your board, this is just the moment to indulge in a great wave of capacity expanding investment. And so they sit on the cash and use it for other things like buying their shares back, of which we've been saying a lot. So although Paul took us to the point where we may be able to operationalise it, I would love to think that one day we really would be able to. And I'd like to close, if I may, with just one thought. I think it's great that we meet and we talk about Keynes and aggregate demand in all of this way. But by the time I'd left the OECD and listened to policymakers from all around the world for the better part of 20 years, I did feel that the UK, and more than any other country, always turns, when it thinks about macroeconomics, to macroeconomic demand. And of course at the other extreme there's the Germans, who disapprove of this enormously and emphasise always the importance of supply. And I think on the balance of years, we might serve ourselves better if we worried most of the time about supply, and only occasionally, which is in a way what Nick was saying, about demand. Although I would say to Nick, I don't think that supply is only flexibility. I think it's also about the level of investment and the rate of change of that. So those are the points that I wanted to make. They're dynamic points. I would love to hear from Robert whether there's anything in Keynes's writing which preceded that and throws light on it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to ask Tony to take us forward.
Great, thank you very much. So I set myself 3 questions, which I took hopefully from the right bits of the rubric. I'm not sure. Question 1 was, in a world of low interest rates and alleged secular stagnation, is there a case for shifting the balance of policy towards more fiscal activism? It's a question that, whose answer is prefigured somewhat by Nick McPherson's remarks. I'm going to answer that question with regard to the short and the long term and give a qualified yes in both cases. So in the long term, supposing we get out of the current predicament, I'm in favour of actually raising the inflation target to make more room for future interest rate cuts, noting that there is a constraint to cutting interest rates, namely the zero bound, or what we used to think was zero may not be now. And in the longer term, instituting a more generous welfare system whose consequence for fiscal stabilisation will be to amplify the automatic stabilisers. So that's the sense in which I give a qualified answer, yes, to move to a more fiscally activist policy. I'm also in favour of a partial delegation of fiscal stabilisation that goes 1 or 2 steps further than the Treasury went with instituting the Office of Budget Responsibility. So, to try and summarise it as briefly as possible, as the zero bound comes into view from the point of view of the Bank of England, we get the Monetary Policy Committee to quantify what it thought was the missing stimulus that the floor to interest rates meant in units of interest rates perhaps, and it would invite the Treasury to fill in the gap. The Treasury would then reserve the right to concur or reject that advice and explain its decision either way. And it would retain the power, obviously, to do the political thing, which would be to design the plan for the stimulus and its unwinding and how it would impinge on different segments of society. The Office of Budget Responsibility would then comment on the consistency of that plan with long-term fiscal solvency, and the Treasury Committee would inevitably comment on the consistency with all of this with the Bank of England's policy remit and the government's stated fiscal and macroeconomic objectives. Amplified automatic stabilisers. So, with if you set higher tax rates and higher replacement ratios in the social security system, this would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. From my perspective, it would address inequality, which obviously is a political matter, but I would see that as a good thing. And it would amplify the automatic stabilisers so that the extent to which tax revenues fell in a recession would increase, and the extent to which benefit payments increased would also increase. Both of those things, without tinkering with actual tax rates, and therefore causing problems with the uncertainty of the tax system that Nick referred to in his remarks, would help stimulate the economy and avoid episodes at the zero bound. So that's the long term. What about the short term? Should we have looser fiscal policy now? I would say yes, but only moderately, noting a few things. So firstly, the Bank of England expects to be able to meet its mandate to achieve the inflation target with some desirable trajectory also for resource utilisation. Why only moderately? Well, personally, I think we have a highly uncertain few years ahead. We're vulnerable to another large recession. We didn't get one after the vote. Doesn't mean we couldn't have one in future. Not the most likely outcome, but it's a non-negligible risk. Such a recession, given the state of the financial system, particularly in the Eurozone, and given our exposures to the Eurozone financial system, could turn into a financial crisis. And in that regard, we need to preserve fiscal space, noting that the debt to GDP ratio currently is about 85%. I don't think the inflection point is 100, like Nick sort of hinted, but it may not be too far above it. And let's be cautious about where it is. Better to be safer than sorry, in my view. So at best, only a moderate fiscal loosening, I think, is needed. Okay, that's the first question. You just have to cut me off when you feel I've run out of time.
I'll get instructions from Mr. Jonathan.
I can talk. I can probably talk for a whole term on this. In fact, I do. That's my job. I'm paid to do precisely that. So question 2 was, has monetary policy really run out of power, or do we just need to adjust its instruments or targets? This is a question, obviously, springing out of Keynes' writing. It was there that I was introduced to the notion of liquidity preference. So I've refined that question in a few ways. So first refinement, is there really a floor to interest rates? Yes, without reform to the institutions of cash. So if cash is there earning zero interest, you'll get nowhere by cutting interest rates below it, because people will switch into the dominant investment, which is cash. We've discovered that the effective floor is not zero. It costs a lot of money to look after huge piles of cash. We don't know how much further below zero it is, but it's certainly nowhere near where, say, the Fed and probably the Bank of England wanted rates to go in the darkest days of the financial crisis, which was something like -7 or -8 percentage points. So essentially there is a profoundly limiting floor to interest rates. There's also a point above that floor below which interest rate cuts are probably no longer stimulatory. And that's why the MPC, for instance, just chose to limit cuts in interest rates in the first instance to 0.5% and not zero, because it felt that cutting rates any further than that would harm bank margins, given the way banks had arranged their lending and deposit contracts. And many people feel that exactly that problem has been going on in the countries that have actually chosen to set negative interest rates. Are there other monetary policies and solutions which could sort of get over these limits? Well, the profession is still debating furiously helicopter money. One can argue semantically whether that's a fiscal policy or a monetary policy. I think that those semantics are a bit boring, but anyway, it's a thing that one can do. Should we do it? In my view, no, except as an absolute last resort. And brackets, I don't think we're doing it anyway currently, although one can debate that. And as I've said, I'm in favour of raising the inflation target, but that's not a policy for now, probably be counterproductive now. It's a policy for where we've got out of the current predicament. Final question, what intellectual contribution did Keynes really make to the way we think about the macroeconomy? Cannot possibly answer that. Is Keynesianism, as broadly understood, these are questions from your rubric, not mine. I'm not so pompously posing them myself to modestly put them to one side. Is Keynesianism, as broadly understood, still the best way to think of the macroeconomy? Can't possibly answer that one. Has the drive within academia towards even more formalised microfonations proved helpful or a dead end? I am going to answer that one. My response to the first bits of the questions are just to point to the fact that there are what I consider to be Keynesian echoes everywhere in the sort of state-of-the-art such as it is in modern macro that I swim around in, have been indoctrinated by, and indoctrinate my students in. To give some examples, prices and wages probably are sticky. We know much more about that now than we did when Keynes was around. We've got huge surveys demonstrating precisely that. There's a debate about exactly what one should infer from it. How sticky they are depends on the size of the shock and the rate of inflation. There's lots of interesting empirical work on that. For those and other reasons, business cycles are themselves inefficient. So Nick pointed to the argument that the current very loose monetary policy and fairly loose fiscal policy, it has to be said, has kept alive businesses that should really be really let to fail. That would only be true if the cycle itself was efficient, and it isn't. If you have sticky prices and wages, and there are many other reasons too that they'd be inefficient, even if one didn't have sticky prices and wages. In model land, who knows what's true in the real world? Because prices and wages are sticky, monetary policy has real effects. So sticky prices and wages causes a problem, but it also gives us a lever to solve the problem.
The bully sitting over there is making us stick now. So
Okay.
that's super. Thank you very much indeed. Joe.
Right, well thank you. I also wanted to start rather loosely with the idea about whether Keynes felt that monetary policy was ineffective in the circumstances in which, maybe 4 years after the event, but nevertheless the circumstances one thinks of as being Keynes's environment. And I think the broad critique would be interest rates are not a very powerful impact on investment, in particular savings investment decisions. That investment depends far more on expectations, under spirits, interest rates not very powerful by contrast, and in any case we have the issues of the liquidity trap, liquidity preference. Can you actually get interest rates down to whatever level will be needed? I'm not going to duck that, except to say that I think the concept of liquidity preference is certainly theoretically questionable, and actually empirically, what is the level of the liquidity trap I think is also been a bit of a movable feast. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, if you asked what was the level of liquidity trap, prevailing wisdom I think would have been something like 2.5–3%. And we've actually seen empirically you can get interest rates at much lower levels than that. Maybe not the -7 or -8%, but I think you have to think that the liquidity trap is not a kind of firm barrier in its own right. The other issue then I think is, well, did Keynes actually believe in this? Do you think that monetary policy was ineffectual? Or actually did he believe Bank of England and Montague Norman were actually incapable of wielding monetary policy the way Keynes thought it should be? And again, I'm agnostic on that, certainly agnostic in an audience where Lord Skidelsky is present. But I think it is notable that Keynes was a monetary economist. That's what he'd spent most of his previous career working on. And of course the word money actually is in the title of General Theory. So I think it's at least an open question as to what Keynes really believed about this. But then, the point I think that Tony raised actually, did the Bank of England, in these circumstances where it might have wanted interest rates to be lower than it was able to make, did it actually resort to a classical monetary response? In my view, the answer is not, certainly not in the sense of helicopter money. There's £575 billion of quantitative easing was at best a very distant relation to what a classical monetary response would have been in circumstances where interest rates have become unavailable. The classical response was you expand the monetary base. You allow government spending to exceed government revenues, and you don't do anything about it. You simply let that appear as cash, as part of the monetary base. Those balances become so large that people want to spend it, and there you've got your stimulus. Now that's a very long way from quantitative easing, which in many ways was just a kind of open market operation. In many ways, actually the opposite of the overfunding that Nigel Lawson and John Major went in for in the 1980s, early 90s. But 2 points do come out of this for me, for both fiscal and monetary policy. In terms of monetary policy, Keynes, I think, was quite explicit that interest rates have both substitution effects, maybe quite weak, but certainly had income effects, that they affected people's income. And once you recognise that, you also have to recognise that they affect different people in different society in different ways. If you are an owner of assets, then interest rates will have one impact. If you're an owner of liabilities, they will have a different impact. If you are young and you have liabilities, they will impact in a way which is different. Or if you're older and you've accrued assets over your lifetime. And it seems to me that's a very strange thing about the current position we are in, that on the fiscal policy side, we have the Institute of Fiscal Studies, we have other bodies doing enormous amounts of detailed work about the distributional consequences of every kind of fiscal change you can make. In terms of monetary policy, very little in analysis or impact of what the changes in monetary policy, whether it's interest rates or quantitative easing, have actually been. We know they're potentially large, that's sort of becoming apparent in the political system. Looking for the analysis and the work that says this is the impact, I think is missing. And that, of course, then begins to have implications for the political applicability of some of these monetary policy changes. Do they have implications for our society in terms of the distributional aspects, which are just too painful to consequence? Now, just one final point, I just want to really comment on Paul Ormerod's point about what's the level of the multiplier, do we know it? Now, I think there's a lot of reasons why there's not going to be any single answer to what is the level of the multiplier. But one in particular that strikes me, which I think is very applicable to any kind of standard Keynesian response, is that you would think the effect would depend upon the nature of the spending, and in particular, whether the nature of the government spending complemented private sector spending or whether it substituted for it. So, for example, if the government decides in its wisdom to buy a travel agent, and remember the government was the proud proprietor of Thomas Cook at a period, and a lot of other strange assets too, why is there any reason to suppose that the government owning Thomas Cook will have any impact as opposed to the private sector owning Thomas Cook? It simply have public sector activity crowding out private sector activity. On the other hand, we know that other forms of expenditure are purely complementary. So infrastructure spending may be of that kind if it actually encourages private sector spending rather than substitutes for it. And I think the same would be true for any kind of skills agenda and any kind of program to raise skills and education. Not so much likely that the private sector will substitute for that kind of spending. So it seems to me that complementarity versus substitution effect is crucially important. It goes with value for money, but it's actually, I think, an important issue in its own right. And really, my very last point, I just wanted, since we were making quotations about Keynes, I wanted to recount the quotation many people will know from Lady Keynes. You know, she was a Russian lady, very fine ballerina, but never really becoming fully fluent in English. And her quotation was, I really do hate the English countryside in August. The barristers bite one's legs so. Now, quite what the barristers are, probably not the word, but make of it what you will.
Thank you very much. Vicky.
Well, the question is, what is left to say? The interesting thing for me is that, of course, as you know, I was brought up in Greece, and so I didn't have sort of Keynes drummed into me. And of course, I went to the LSE, so I was taught by monetarists, so it's quite an interesting start in life, although I'm actually a real Keynesian. And nevertheless, I didn't believe anything I was told by those people. But the interesting thing is, it's really to just take some of the points made, particularly by Nick, but also what we've just been hearing. It is, in many ways, this unfair to be looking at what the monetary policy is and saying, actually, it's doing things wrongly, such as maybe it's affecting distribution, of income and wealth and all that sort of stuff. In reality, Mark Carney and Mario Draghi have both been saying constantly that what they really want is more of a fiscal response in order to, in many ways, balance what they're doing, and probably wouldn't need to be doing what they're doing if there had been more of a fiscal response. And the distributional aspect, I had to comment on a question on this in one of the papers. Is the monetary policy to blame for this? I firmly think that that it's fiscal policy that should be doing the redistribution. And you've seen what's happened in the last autumn statement, where all the calculations done by the Resolution Foundation and the IFS suggest that actually what we're doing is we're punishing the people at the lower end. And look at simply the agreement now to raise council tax by 6%, up to 6%, in order to fund social care up front. Well, that is a very regressive tax. So that's basically what fiscal policy seems to be achieving, and we've got to be very, very careful to, of course we need to see what the distributional aspects of monetary policy is, but let's not get away from the fact that actually fiscal policy is incredibly important there. Perhaps we better look at that one first. And of course, having worked for the government, I would say that we were very involved in looking at doing cost-benefit analysis and everything, and appraisals in advance of any policy. Very rarely do we do that, or did we do that, and maybe the Treasury has improved this, on the, if you like, unintended consequences of tax changes. Stamp duty, very important one, where you raise stamp duty for political reasons and you end up collecting less. Hole there, which could easily have been spent for the National Health Service. And of course, I mean, Nick would say, let's fleece the old and rich. How many times are we going to do that? We're going to use everything we take away from the bus passes to pay for the National Health Service. And now, interestingly, from what Nick is saying, infrastructure. Brilliant. So we can, we move one from the other. It's very interesting to see how it's all going to work with public accounts, which are very, very convoluted, as we all know, in terms of moving from current to current and so on, and vice versa. And infrastructure. I mean, Keynes did indeed, develop the multiplier infrastructure, and we forget it at our peril. For years, unless I'm mistaken again, but for years the Treasury just didn't want to touch, didn't want to spend anything, and therefore infrastructure spending itself was not encouraged particularly, because of course we just heard Nick say, it takes a long time, you can't cut them off. But the reality is, the first thing that you can cut if you want to reduce your deficit is capital spending, which of course has huge consequences in terms of the productive sector of the economy. That's precisely what was done early on in the banking crisis. It wasn't actually encouraged. It was, what you wanted to do after you were sort of semi-recovered is cut the capital spending that was there. Of course, that reduced the productive capacity of the economy, and now we're looking at it and saying, why is productivity growing so slowly? So we've basically done it on ourselves. And the idea, I mean, I remember again, Secretaries of State coming to us and saying, we wanted to do more infrastructure, but the Treasury is telling us that actually it takes a long time to get any project even approved. It's not true. We've just had all these announcements now of quick things that could be done, which could actually make a difference. So, of course, HS2, Heathrow, and so on take hundreds of years and may never happen, but that's a different issue. But you can do an awful lot more, particularly, of course, housing. And why is it important, infrastructure and housing? It is because you don't get the leakages that you do on everything else, on current spending. So if you do helicopter money and give people extra cash in their pocket, so you cut VAT, then of course they're going to buy lots of goods, possibly. A very large percentage of that is reduced abroad, whereas infrastructure and housing in particular, you get very few leakages and there is a real regional impact there. Then again, when you look at public spending, what is a public good? Again, we heard that maybe actually education, skills is really important. What happened as soon as we got out of the crisis and we wanted everything to be cut? We raised tuition fees. So suddenly, higher education was no longer a public good. I was sitting at the National Economic Council's officials group where we did everything, which of course was chaired on and off by Nick. We did everything to get the economy going, and he's absolutely right. The thing that really worked best was making sure that credit constraint was dealt with. Absolutely right. I think the authorities did absolutely the right thing there. But of course, we were also looking, how else can we spend the money in such a way? But of course, the moment we had a change in government, or a hint of the change in government, all these things were just thrown out. Let's go back to cutting. So the important thing for me is therefore that we are seriously underestimating the impact of fiscal policy on growth, distribution, productivity, and we should focus an awful lot more on that. And the poor monetary authorities have had to deal with an environment where they were getting, until now anyway, now that the Treasury, in order to get the economy moving again, has rediscovered infrastructure with great passion. So far, it has been the monetary authorities that have kept the show on the road.
Well, Vicky, thank you very much for that. Of course, although we think of James Callaghan's speech being a speech that junked the Keynesian consensus, The actual real junk of it was the 1976 Public Expenditure White Paper published in, I think, February 1976, where there were discretionary cuts in public spending as unemployment was actually rising. And as Vicky says, a lot of that was actually focused on investment and capital spending. And the first senior Treasury official I ever got to know was a woman called Jennifer Forsyth, who I think was a mutual friend of Nick and mine. And she explained to me in elaborate detail, and indeed with great disapproval and horror, how she and Nick Monk went about doing that. But I know that Lord Skidelsky is here. He's heard a number of things that he quite understandably is interested in commenting on and balancing. So, Robert, would you like to have a crack at us?
Yeah.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I really want to make four points. First of all, I do think the Treasury's management of the economy between 2010 and 2016 was absolutely disastrous. I don't blame Nick for that. I blame his master, George Osborne. I think he had an ideological agenda, and he used the difficulties of the economy as an excuse to do it. The ideological agenda was quite clear before he got into power, even before the crisis really struck. Nick says that public debt ratio to GDP was rising to a dangerous point, and there have been one or two remarks suggesting there's an inflection point. I once asked George Osborne, who was the economist that influenced you most in your period as Chancellor, and he said Kenneth Rogoff. And Kenneth Rogoff was the 90% inflection point. I don't believe there is a 90% inflection point. I don't believe there's actually any inflection point. It depends on the situation. But certainly that seemed to be a piece of conventional wisdom, and I think it had pretty disastrous effects. And of course, one reason why the debt to GDP ratio has been rising and chancellors have failed to achieve their deficit reduction targets is, of course, because the economy was growing so slowly. And the OBR consistently overestimated the growth, pretty consistently overestimated the growth of the economy. And the results proved to be disappointing. And I think they did so ultimately, and this also relates to Paul Ormerod's point about the multiplier. I think they had the wrong model of the economy. I think they believed that there were very strong forces making for automatic recovery, and therefore, multipliers were bound to be small and diminishing as time went on. I think they were wrong over the time period they were forecasting. Second point, labour market flexibility. It's quite true, I think, that the labour market is very different, works very differently from Keynes's time, where a collapse in aggregate demand would be reflected quite simply in a rise in unemployment. But you have to consider whether full employment achieved by depressing wages also depresses aggregate demand. And that was the conclusion of the general theory. And so he didn't advocate that kind of wage flexibility. He didn't advocate wage flexibility. He said his theory was true under any conditions. It is, I know, Professor Yates made this point, a new Keynesian nostrum, that all that goes wrong, and that of course is why business cycles are inefficient, is because wages and prices were sticky. That is not Keynes. That is new Keynesianism. It's a very different type. It's a very different proposition. Third point is on monetary, the turn to fiscal. I think Mark Carney was quite right when he said the other day that QE was really a life support system. and it was keeping the economy on life support. But that was very, very different from the original aims of the Monetary Policy Committee and of monetary policy. I mean, I've read through some of those things. I mean, they were always talking about achieving their inflation target within a reasonable number of, within a reasonable period. What do they mean by a reasonable period? Maybe 2 or 3 years. They never achieved their inflation target because the instrument, the mechanism, was much too leaky to be able to do that. And in that sense, I agree very much with, I think it was you who said that it's a very, very indirect mechanism, and I would have preferred them to have gone in for monetary financing of the deficit. I think that's what's now coming into contention again. I think it should always have been done that way, and that is, I think, a modern version of helicopter money, which has been advocated by Ben Bernanke, among others, Professor Mulbar, and so on. So I think those are the real points I make. And the last point about animal spirits, well, yes, Keynes didn't really he didn't really explain, he might have explained the business cycle, perhaps, by the ebb and flow of animal spirits, but he attached a great deal of importance to conventions. And it was really the conventional view, which was a sort of kind of herd behavior, but the conventional view of what the situation was, which he thought trapped people into, businessmen particularly, into trapped expectations. And one of his famous remarks was, businessmen and bankers prefer to be ruined in a conventional way. And I think that's an important aspect of his view of expectations, because he believed in uncertainty. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. John. Yes. John Wood. We'll be speaking later on Keynes'
Can I have a small point in support of what Robert Skidelsky was just saying? The reference to Rogoff and the relevance to the previous chancellor. The empirical basis was provided by Rogoff and Reinhardt, and I would just draw people's attention to an article in the Cambridge Journal, which they may not be aware of. I think it was published in 2014, which demonstrated that there was a serious coding error, thereby vitiating the whole analysis. It was a very small point, a small empirical point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we break, are there any more questions to the panel or to Nick? First of all, and I'm very conscious we've got a lot of people here. I mean, Christopher, if there's anything you all minded to say, you know a lot about infrastructure.
Well, let me ask quick about infrastructure.
So this is Christopher Foster, the transport economist who.
There's an awful lot one would like to talk about, and it's a splendid occasion. But, Vicky, would you make any distinction between productive infrastructure and things like HS2? It's not really quite a problem at the present moment of an awful lot of expenditure going on, which not all of it is infrastructure or capital, but is far from obviously productive. Don't we need to think very, very hard about what is worth doing? I realise that Keynes himself at times suggested something is better than nothing, but surely productive infrastructure, etc., is much more worthwhile than unproductive.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I actually mentioned HS2 en passant, if you like, as something that might take a long time. But actually, I've always been completely against it. I think we should do proper cost-benefit analysis on this, and as you know, this is one of the interesting examples where the reason for having HS2, because it didn't pass the first test, you just changed the criteria that you use to determine whether you want it or not. So instead of it being now cutting the amount of time, because that's been proven not to be particularly significant. We think of it more in terms of the infrastructure, what it might do to the area in which this stops may happen, if you like. So no, I think you're absolutely right. That sort of, we should just abandon this idea, but of course it's already been pre-announced a number of times. And think of productive stuff. That's why I mentioned skills. I mean, skills. I mean, if you look at capital investment, loads more areas where we can get a lot. And then even on infrastructure, what type of transport infrastructure you go for? Roads, good idea. Local rail,
no.
Good idea. Trams, don't touch them. And yet everyone seems to be in favour of trams in
Until
various places.
recently.
So all sorts of things like that. So you're absolutely right, and I agree with that entirely.
And I think this point, which I think Nick, somebody made, certainly, that an awful lot of attention needs to be given up to the supply side, its efficiency throughout the public sector, so that we're not wasting money by, for attention to efficiency. And one wonders to what extent the Treasury is thinking seriously about that.
Well, it's very neatly picked up by Nick. Do you want to actually have the machine? Yeah.
Can I just show violent agreement with on this point? I mean, first, you're absolutely right. I can't remember who was quoting. Actually, it was you, Warwick, Jennifer Forsyth, and Nick Monk. I mean, I was responsible for coordinating public spending in '92, and I'm afraid, I'm embarrassed that the first thing we went for was the transport programme. Why did we do that? Because at that time we didn't distinguish current from capital spend. It's a little known reform of Gordon Brown, but it's the one which I think perhaps the most important was separating capital from current. And I think that is really important. And on infrastructure, you really do need to look at the rate of return. To be fair to my friend Mr. Osborne, actually a lot of the spending review of 2010, we did actually produce some giant spreadsheets across both transport modes and between programmes, trying also to pick up social cost when it came to prison building and so on, to rank investment projects by their return, and I think that's really important. I mean, I can say this now because I've left the Treasury. I was never a fan of high speed 2. I'm always against prestige projects, and it's like trams. Trams. I mean, localities are obsessed with trams, but you only have to look at Edinburgh to see just how expensive the tram system is, and actually how it's slower getting in from the airport than by bus. So. Sadly though, the problem with sort of boring bypasses and local rail schemes is that politicians who get to where they are in life, not by actually generally what they do because the time horizon is too long, but by what they announce, these things are not sexy. And the Treasury's had a really hard, we've had very slow going in trying to influence it. And George Osborne's response to me always was, I bet the Treasury was against the M25. And I did try and find the papers on the M25, but I never managed to track them down.
Probably Christopher Scott.
Bits that they were, bits that they weren't.
There you go. Gentleman there.
Since we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about physical infrastructure. Part of that physical infrastructure is the role of a broadband. And again, broadband is a general purpose technology. The thing that adds the value is the software. And we have GDS and PolicyLab tinkering at the edges, doing a low-hanging fruit. And there's a much bigger prize to be had. And yet, the government are deaf to looking at new ideas and innovation from small organisations. That wasn't a plug, by the way, but
Yes.
It's a desperate situation.
Francis.
Well, I wanted to pick up a point entirely unrelated to infrastructure, actually, but that's to do with the relationship, which I think Tony mentioned, about the relationship between monetary and fiscal policy. Because it seems to me that we have become almost pulling in opposite directions. So, for example, we've had England trying to encourage borrowing and spending by keeping interest rates very low and so forth, at the same time as we have the government intent on getting everybody to save. It seems to me that actually giving this kind of mixed message is perhaps not very helpful from a signalling point of view, and I'm wondering whether Keynes would have suggested doing something a little more, with a little more coordination.
There's a lot of policy at war with itself.
Yeah, exactly. On a related note, if I may mention it, that also this sort of antagonism between public and private sector, I think, is quite right of the mark as well, because what we seem to be having at the moment, and I can give you some personal examples of this if you really want to know, is examples where the public sector steps back saying, oh no, we mustn't do that because the private sector will be crowding out the private sector, and the private sector says we don't want to know. And then you end up with huge swathes of area where nothing's provided. We have market failures in, for example, in social care and so forth, where we have stepped back too far and we have not worked out, I think, who should be doing what, and particularly perhaps what the role of the third sector is.
Well, I'm going to say thank our panel very much indeed for all of that. I'm conscious we'd better get some caffeine if we're not to get behind time. I'm also conscious of the attacks on the rich elderly. I'm a local councillor in Kensington and Chelsea, and most of my time there has been spent dealing with personal social services. So I spent a large part of my adult life delivering services for the rich elderly. And of course the fascinating thing is, about all that social care, is at the end of people's lives, people have had hugely successful careers. You'll be so surprised how few assets there are to get hold of to actually pay for their care at the very end. People have had incredibly successful careers, people who've been incredibly wealthy at various stages of their lives. When you end up taking responsibility for their affairs, it's a quite astonishing picture of the life cycle. But thank you all very much indeed, and thank you, Lord Skidelsky, for being so game to set us straight. And he's going to talk to us later on about Keynes the man.